Hi, I'm Jim Gabbert. I'm a historian with the National Register of Historic Places program here at the National Park Service. As you may or may not remember from my introduction 10 minutes ago, I've been with the Park Service for 12 years. My job is to review and either accept or provide comments on nominations from 15 states and territories. There are a number of us reviewers, and I'm here to talk to you about this National Register of Historic Places, what it is, hopefully educate you on what it isn't. As we just learned about the National Historic Preservation Act, the centerpiece of that act, obviously the most important part of the act, was it created a National Register of Historic Places. Now, prior to the act, that we did have the list of National Historic Landmarks, and all of those had been designated from 1935 until October 15th of 1966 were automatically included in the National Register. So on the 15th of October 1966, the National Register was populated by more than 800 things already. But since that time, the register has been expanded and maintained technically by the Secretary of the Interior, but through the National Park Service. We could go on forever and ever and ever talking about the National Historic Preservation Act and what it is, and what we can talk about now is what is the National Register of Historic Places, and in particular what it isn't. I've been dealing with this program for all of my preservation career, and I've heard it called a million things. It is the National Register of Historic Places. So what is the National Register of Historic Places? It's a planning tool. That's its main intent. It was to be a list of properties worthy of preservation that federal agencies would use in planning undertakings, and with any hope avoiding those historic properties. So it's a component of federal environmental review process. It's also a recognition that places are important to communities, to states, to the nation, and that people place value on places for various reasons. It's also a process of documentation. A lot of times the information that is put together in a National Register of Historic Places nomination is the only source of information about that property that is easily accessible. What the National Register can also be is a tool. It's a tool for economic development. As you'll learn more about the Tax Act later in other webinars, but that is one of the major incentives for getting properties listed in the National Register, either individually or as part of historic districts. It can also become a centerpiece for community identity. How many times have you driven through a town that has signs about their historic district? It becomes a source of pride for communities, for individual property owners. As I noted, this documentation can include all kinds of interesting information, or at least links, bibliographies to other information. So it's a really good source of information. National Register nominations can be used to create interpretation for particular properties, for walking tours, etc. So there are myriad uses for the National Register. You have to find them, of course. But what it isn't a guarantee of preservation. Listing in the National Register of Historic Places places no requirements or restrictions on owners of private property. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about the National Register. We can get into that in the Q&A if necessary, but it's not a guarantee of preservation, even in the federal review process. Sometimes a highway has to go where a highway has to go, and historic properties have to be demolished. definitely not a guarantee of funding. When I worked in the state preservation office, that was the most common call I got, is I heard there's grants available for me to fix up my house. Well, there generally aren't. Most historic properties are not going to be eligible for the few federal dollars that are out there. And for for other grant giving institutions, foundations, etc., it may be a component of eligibility, but it's not a guarantee. So it doesn't restrict what you do, doesn't require anything, and we don't give you a plaque. You got to buy your own plaque. So the National Register of Historic Places program is administered by the Park Service on behalf of the Secretary of the Interior. The law gives orders the Secretary of the Interior to expand and maintain a National Register of Historic Places. He delegated that authority to the National Park Service. The director delegated that authority to a position known as the Keeper of the National Register. There is an actual person at this moment that would be my boss, Joy. She's my boss's boss, my boss's boss's boss, etc. So she doesn't have the day-to-day workings of the program, so a lot of the authority has been delegated to the keeper's minions. I am a minion. I have the authority to list properties in the National Register with my signature. Now, anyone can create a National Register nomination, but there are only 3 entities that can actually nominate them for listing, and those are state historic preservation officers, federal preservation officers, and tribal historic preservation officers. And all of this is found in the regulations that guide our program, 36 CFR Part 60. Have fun reading that. So there are numbers involved here. There are 4 basic criteria for evaluation. These criteria are written very broadly and can encompass a lot of potential areas of significance. There are 5 property types. There are 3 levels of significance. And as of this week, there are more than 95,500 listings in the National Register. And by listings, I mean that can be an individual building, or it may be a historic district like the Mid-City Historic District in New Orleans, Louisiana, which has more than 10,000 buildings in its boundaries. So the 4 criteria are simply A, B, C, and D. A, properties that are associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. B, properties that are associated with the lives of persons significant in our past. An event can be a singularity, a battle, or it can be a continuum of events, education or commerce. B, for association with persons of significance, is more than just George Washington slept here. There has to be a direct tie between that significant person and the place during that person's productive life. C and D. C are most popular properties that embody the distinguishing characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or that represent the work of a master, or that possess high artistic values, or that represent a distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. A lot of times this boils down to, quote, architecture, but it's a lot more than that. It is about the physical qualities of a resource and their distinctive and significant qualities. That last little phrase there refers to historic districts, where the sum of the whole is more important than the individual components. The last criterion, D, is for properties that have yielded or may be likely to yield information important in prehistory or history. This is typically used for archaeology, but is not limited to archaeology. So the 5 property types: buildings, structures, sites, objects, and districts. Districts which may be composed of many buildings, structures, sites, or objects. The National Historic Landmark Program, which was created in the 1935 Act, looked at properties of national significance. The revolutionary part of the National Historic Preservation Act was, by creating the National Register, it specifically wanted us to look at properties of other levels of significance. So the state level or the local level, and by far, most properties listed in the National Register are listed at the local level of significance, for their significance to a local community, to the history of that local community, to the cultural identity of a local community. So what can we list? Well, it has to be one of the 5 property types. It has to be demonstrated to be significant in at least one of the 4 criteria. Doesn't need to be all 4 criteria. It doesn't need to be multiple criteria. It can be simply one criterion. And it has to have sufficient historic integrity to reflect that significance. There are 7 aspects of integrity. I'm not going to go into all the 7 aspects, but these are flexible in how they're applied. So if we're looking at a property whose significance is under criterion C, the quote, architecture, we're going to look more carefully at the physical qualities of design and materials and workmanship than we would if its significance lies under criterion A for association with events, where changes over time may not have as an important impact on the historic integrity of the resource if it is still recognizable for its use during that time, or if it changed during that use over time. So it's got to be one of the 5 property types. It has to meet one of the 4 criteria, and it has to have sufficient historic integrity to reflect that importance. So let's get to the actual nomination. We are a federal agency, so we have forms for that. So what goes into the forms informs us of why a property is important and worthy of preservation. A nomination provides us with sufficient information to demonstrate that a property is important in some aspect of our history and that it retains sufficient integrity to reflect that significance. The most important thing to understand, the 3 most important things, is a nomination is not a history of things. It's using history of something to evaluate it within a proper context. So the 3 most important things to understand when you're reviewing a property or evaluating a property is, what is the proper context? What is the theme that we're looking at? Is the theme architecture? Is the theme education? Is the theme community planning and development? And when are we looking at this? Are we looking at it at a specific period in time, a specific year, a specific date? Are we looking at it over a broad range of time? And are we evaluating this for its importance locally, at the state level, or nationally? So context, 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 very important, and understanding what a context is important. So a theme might be architecture in the federal period. It can be very broad. It could be transportation. In transportation, it could also be focused on something like Route 66. The time, is it the 19th century? Is it the New Deal? Is it a specific year? The place? Do we need to evaluate this at a high level, at a low level? And this relates to the level of significance. For example, let's take a U.S. Post Office. Well, the theme of the U.S. Postal Service is national in scale and arguably nationally important. The post office in your hometown likely only has significance within the context of your town, the geographic area that that post office historically served. So it's a local manifestation of a nationally important theme. So what goes into a nomination? There are lots of check boxes and fill in the blanks, but the basic meat of a nomination is what we call Section 7, a description of the property, and Section 8, a description of its significance. So Section 7 is a description of the property is at the time of its nomination. In that description, you're also going to tell us what changes have occurred over time, and you're going to analyze how those changes affect the historic integrity of the property, or how those changes reflect the significance of the property. In Section 8, the statement of significance, you're going to give us a historical examination of the property within a context or multiple contexts, and you're going to create a reasoned argument for why a property is important. So that's what a nomination is. It's a position paper. It's telling us, using historic information, why a property is important and is worthy of preservation. So, as I say, anyone can write a nomination. I have seen nominations. I literally have a nomination in my queue right now that was written by a Girl Scout. I think she's 14 or 15 years old. I listed a nomination that was written by a group of 8th graders 3 weeks ago. So anyone can prepare a nomination, but it is submitted through the appropriate nominating authority. And for most nominations, that's a state historic preservation officer for processing, following the guidance in our regulations. The SHPO has to notify owners, local elected officials, review it formally through a state review board, and then they submit it to the National Park Service, to the keeper. We have 45 days to act upon that nomination. So interns, you're looking for jobs. Who does nominations? There are a variety of academic backgrounds that are useful in preparing nominations, but it's not limited to any particular background. You don't have to be a historian. If you are able to put a little bit of research effort and 3 or 4 sentences together, you should be able to do it. So nomination is a collaborative process. Nomination preparers partner with the State Preservation Office, the SHPO partners with the keeper, and together we see the process through to gain recognition for our historic resources. And now I can turn it over to questions, and hopefully I can get back to my screen as necessary. So do we have questions?
Yeah, Jim, here's one. What is typically the protocol for when a historic property that is eligible for the National Register conflicts or sits upon a prehistoric site, like an archaeological site, that could be deemed eligible for the National Register?
Well, there is nothing that prevents a nomination for both. If each of the properties, the archaeological site as a prehistoric site and the historic resource that sits atop it, retain sufficient historic integrity to reflect their significance. I'm not an archaeologist. I don't dabble in the dark arts. But I have been told by our archaeologists that it really doesn't matter so much what's on top of an archaeological site, so long as the subsurface deposits are still there. And through limited testing, you're able to establish the extent of the site enough to evaluate whether the disturbance of that new construction has diminished its capacity to yield its information. So we do have archaeological sites that are under parking lots that are listed. That answers.
Well, we'll leave it for now, unless there's any more.
There is one more.
Oh, I do see that one from Mark. An ongoing debate. So Jim, you'll be the definer of this. Is it listed in the National Register or on the National Register?
Well, that's an interesting question.
It's a burning question.
Our program uses in. We prefer in, but the law itself uses both. So either is correct, but in is preferable.
I see. Okay. And another question, this one from Marissa. What is the relationship between listings in the National Register and cultural landscape reports?
Cultural landscape reports are standalone documents. The National Park Service does many cultural landscape reports for units of the Park Service, and they can serve as a basis for an evaluation, but they are separate entities. So preparing a cultural landscape report is a means and an end unto itself.
Excellent. Okay, if there are any more questions for Jim, we can take that at the end if there's time. But I do want to